Constantine, a Hellblazer podcast.
Hey there, everybody, and welcome back to John Constantine, a Hellblazer podcast. Today we are reading issue number 117, and just a little catch up on what's been going on. In the last issue, we saw a graveyard that was being kind of dug up. There was some construction going on around it, and this activity seemed to be disturbing the spirits of the people who were interred in the ground, and they began to rise and try to lash out at people. Now, at the same time, we met a new character. His name is Slobodan, and he has newly arrived from Serbia, where there's a lot of war going on, and so he's actually a friend of Rich more than John, because Rich lets Slobodan and his family stay at his house, which they do. They eventually get to rent a place right next to this graveyard. Now, unfortunately, because of all the war stuff going on, Slobodan definitely has some kind of past that he's not bringing up and no one else really wants to talk about either. But the ghosts are kind of feeding off of this bad energy. So at the end of the last issue, we saw him get possessed after arguing with Rich while they were working on the house. And as everything kind of came to a head and the dead spirits begin to rise and attack people, we saw Slobodan become possessed by one of these ghosts, presumably. And when John hears screaming because he was outside, he rushes in and he finds Slobodan possessed, holding a knife to his child's throat. And that is where we left off on the last issue. So first things first, with issue 117, we got the cover. We see John sitting on a large gravestone. He's got a pocket watch in his hand like he's timing someone. And we see the jogger from the past issue who's running with his Walkman. And behind the jogger, he's being trailed by a bunch of green spirits that look very angry and upset. And we also see on the cover that this is written by Paul Jenkins with art by Sean Phillips. And we start off on the first page with a flashback that is set in what looks like the 1600s or somewhere around there. So we see a white guy sitting in a cart that has this chicken, and the ground is snow covered, so it must be wintertime. And we get some narration over these panels that says, "A good story's always improved by illustration. This one's illustrated by a chicken. It also co-stars no less a luminary than Sir Francis Bacon, erstwhile Lord Chancellor of England, and criminally underrated playwright. At the time of our tale, Sir Francis just spent 2 years in the Tower under suspicion of bribery. After much navel-gazing, he's decided to turn his attention to science. The secrets of the cosmos are entirely safe, mind. It's fair to say our man Frank hasn't had a clue since his late 40s. Still, one afternoon, as he's clomping about somewhere near Pond Square in Highgate, our undaunted hero notices something interesting under his carriage. Being an inquisitive sort of chap, Sir Frank steps down to investigate. Curiously, the grass that's blanketed with the snow is still green, despite the cold air. Strike a light, he thinks. I wouldn't be at all surprised if the snow is somehow acting as a preservative. At which point, citing the dubious influence of divine inspiration, he garrots some poor bleeding chicken he bought down in the market and begins stuffing snow up his arse. So the chicken that was in the back of the carriage was the one that he killed. Then we turn the page and we get a panel of Sir Francis Bacon sneezing after he does this experiment with shoving some ice inside of the chicken. And the narration continues saying, "Now, Sir Frank's not as nifty as he used to be. All that gallivanting about has left him feeling a bit grotty. The chicken, alas, is given no chance to gloat after the fact." We get a panel of some distraught-looking people who are looking into a bedroom where we can see some feet that look like they might belong to a dead person. And the narration continues saying, "As it turns out, the silly old sod's come down with influenza. 2 days later, it catapults him into the great unknown, presumably having spotted the loose connection between farting around in the cold weather and sneezing. But our story doesn't end there. Then we cut to what looks like the 70s, and it looks like this is the same street that Sir Francis Bacon was riding on when he killed the chicken, and we see some of the local Englanders pointing like they're very shocked at what they're seeing, but we don't see what they're pointing at, and the narration continues. Over the years, discordant, unearthly noises are detected at the very same spot where Lord Bacon caught his death of cold. Alarming sights are seen on the periphery, lurking in the shadows. As time passes, hundreds of terrified bystanders claim witness to a screeching, persistent apparition of the horrible headless chicken of Highgate. Then we get a panel of what everybody's staring at in the 70s, and we see it is a ghostly apparition of the dead carcass of a chicken running around. And when I say dead carcass, I mean this chicken has been plucked and everything's been removed from it. So it basically looks like a chicken that you would buy at a store that's ready to cook that's running around. Then we turn the page and we cut to modern day where we see John is lighting a cigarette, and the narration continues saying, "Clear as cat shit, right? Well, see, ghosts are generally imprints of a disturbing event, and Pond Square had Sir Frank's psychic size 12s all over it. Because of his importance, the chicken was destined to spend the rest of eternity there, flapping the locals." Then we get a panel from the outside at the graveyard and we see a bunch of spirits rising. Then we get a panel from the first floor of Slobodon's house where we see Michelle pointing up to the second stairs, and she's telling Straff and Rich probably what's going on with Slobodon in the room above. And over these panels, the narration says, "Flash forward to this afternoon and to a display of special fireworks that entirely disproves the aforementioned theory. A quiet suburban cemetery's suddenly gone apeshit, and I'm the little monkey that's being blamed for the smell. The catch is this. I know I've done nothing wrong this time. The spirits are acting like psychic leeches, attaching themselves to everyone's fear, mine included. Not that hauntings ever made any earthly sense, but this little effort really does take the bloody biscuit. Oh well, in for a penny." So we cut back to John, who's standing in the doorway of Slobodon's child's room. And like I said, he's just lit a cigarette, he's taking a couple puffs, and he's looking at Slobodon, who's still grabbing his child by the face and holding a knife to them. But Slobodon's attention is brought up to John as John says to him, "I assume there's a good explanation for this." And we also see on this page that the name of this issue is Widdershins Part 2. And as we turn the page, we see that Slobodon has let his child go, and he turns to John and he stands up, and out of his mouth, the ghosts inside of him respond,
"There is art. Let us rest. This one is afraid."
And John sarcastically says to all of them, "One at a time, eh? Afraid of what?" And one of the ghosts inside of Slobodon replies,
"Afraid it is flesh. Fear of what it has done. To be discovered. This, its anger, remembered. Enemy mutilation. Afraid of the child. Not to do as once before he did."
And what this spirit here is talking about is, it was mentioned in the last issue a little bit, but Slav has come over from Serbia, and at this time there was a war going on in that region, and we assume that's why Slav came over here, but we definitely heard Michelle talking to Danny in the last issue about how she was kind of concerned because she wasn't sure what Slobodon had done when he was over there, because he was doing some fighting in this war, and she was worried that he might have done some things that maybe meant he wasn't that great of a person. And that stuff seems to be what these ghosts are feeding off of, because while the ghosts are talking, we're getting flashes of Slobodon running around the streets with an AK-47, and he's screaming in anger as he's shooting it, and in front of him we're seeing someone getting shot in the head at point-blank range by a pistol, and then we get another panel of Slobodon holding a pistol to a child, and it seems like maybe he did kill this child because that is the emotions that these ghosts are feeding off of, because he does not want to be discovered. He does not want anybody to find out what he did in this war. So as John listens to the ghost's explanation, he puffs on his cigarettes and his narration says, "Perfectly atrocious and painfully obvious. The spirits dredged up some of Slob's old terrors and has left them dangling for all to see. And yet, this just doesn't seem right. There's no sense to any of it. See, dispossessed spirits never indiscriminately visit ill upon the living, unless there's a good reason. This one's challenging, waiting for me to come up with the answer to a question it can't ask." So John takes charge of this conversation and he asks, "Why me then? What have I got to do with any of this?" And the possessed Slobodon answers,
You are to blame. Disturbed. Interference."
And as the spirit says this, the child in the room also begins to levitate, and I guess this is because she's been possessed as well. Or at least the ghosts are affecting her in some way. So as she's hovering now in front of John, in between Slobodon and him, John says to the accusations that he is the reason for all this, saying, "Bollocks. Nice pyrotechnics, but you're reaching. And the ghost inside Slobodan replies,
We have the child. Your fear.
And then the ghost separates from Slobodan and releases his body, and then it floats up to the hovering child, and it continues saying,
Kill the child, we will. Your fault.
And John, trying to play it cool, says, Yeah, I've heard that routine before. What's the matter, running out of ideas? And this angers the ghosts, and they actually hold the knife up to the floating child, and they yell to John,
No, child, your responsibility. Hurts. Protection.
And before John has time to say anything, we see Weeble enter the doorway behind John, and he says,
It's lying.
And then John turns around and jokes, saying, Christ almighty, how is the orgasmatron? I guess referring to when Weeble was possessed outside, his spasms while he was on the ground looked like he was having a bunch of orgasms. But Weeble doesn't really acknowledge John's joke, he just comes in and says,
This one's getting desperate, John. It needs you.
And John asks, Why? And Weeble answers,
Who knows? It's like they're blind sometimes. They just scramble about, putting out feelers.
And we see in the background as they're talking, the ghosts are repossessing Slobodan, and the girl has come down to the ground, and the ghosts look very menacing around them. And as the possessed Slobodan once again grabs his child by the face, Weeble comes over and he grabs Slobodan by the neck and says,
Right then, Sunbeam, what do you want?
And the ghost replies,
Help us. You must. Or the child.
And Weeble replies,
No deals. Leave and we'll do the best we can.
But then before the ghosts can really answer him, all of a sudden the ghosts begin to cry out in pain, and they rush out of Slob and his daughter's bodies, and they're yelling,
No, it is the wrong way.
And then the ghosts just leave. And as Slobodan and his daughter come to, she yells out for her dad, and Slobodan immediately comes down to comfort her. And while that's going on, John goes up to Weeble, and he gets in his face and he asks, What does we mean exactly? Because Weeble told the ghosts, We'll do the best we can. And Weeble answers him saying,
I've taken an interest. And besides, you owe me.
And as he says this, he pushes past John, and he begins to walk out of the room, and John says after him,
No chance, mate. We're all settled up. Besides, what can I do?
And without turning around, Weeble calls back,
How should I know? I'm not fucking Gandhi, am I?
And as Slobodan holds his terrified child in his arms, we see a confused John say to himself, Gandhi? Then we turn the page and we see John has followed Weeble downstairs, and as the two of them sit on the back stoop looking towards the graveyard, everything looks pretty peaceful now, and John says,
All's quiet then. Any ideas?
And Weeble answers,
Come on, Constantine. You're a player. You know the score.
And John says, You know me, Weeble. I don't know anything about that stuff. So Weeble tries to explain, saying,
Look, that whole radio dial analogy applies here. I mean, half of the ones I tune into claim they're bleeding Adolf Hitler.
And John says, I know, Weeb. They're unpredictable most of the time. Still doesn't explain why they'd come back to haunt a bloody cemetery, though. And Weeble replies,
True enough. But they're certain about one thing, John. They want you for some reason, but they don't know how to say it. It's the way it goes, John. I mean, did I ever tell you about my first time?
Then we get a flashback sequence as Weeble recounts to John the first time anything supernatural ever happened to him. So we see a young Weeble, and he's kind of wrestling with some kids in front of some sort of castle, and it seems they're on like a field trip or something. And we see the young Weeble end up being in the castle alone, and Weeble narrates, I was about 10, and we'd gone on this school trip to Hever Castle in Kent. It's one of about 90 places that Anne Boleyn's supposed to haunt. I was at the back of the group, looking at the ramparts to see if I could spot her. But when I looked down, all the other kids were going inside one of the turrets, right? So I booked up the stairs fast as I could, trying to catch up. I could hear all the other kids talking up ahead. But then, this door closed, and it went really quiet. The voices sounded like echoes. It was seriously weird. I could feel this real sadness in there, like a big despair. I started shouting because I was getting scared. Lucky for me, the teacher had decided to wait at the top of the stairs. I was sweating too much to clearly see,
and I was about to start bawling as I ran up to her.
So we see a young weeble walking up the stairs to a woman in silhouette, and she looks like she's wearing a habit or something. And then we see the young weeble having to stop on the top step because it actually leads to a big drop-off, and the woman had disappeared by the time he got there. And Weeble's narration continues,
"But she fucking disappeared, just like that, right where the stone steps end, in a sheer drop. 1 more inch, and I'd have been flat as a pancake."
Then we cut back to present, away from that flashback, and Weeble continues saying to John,
"I know it was her, man. Anne Boleyn. Anyone would think she was trying to kill me, but ghosts don't do that. They just want someone to talk to."
Then we turn the page, and we cut to the lives of the 4 people who were affected by the ghosts. In the first one, we see Irene, who was the woman who was looking at child pornography in the last issue. And as she scrubs her hands vigorously in the sink, the narration says, "Afterwards, Irene had taken the time to reflect on losing her bloody mind. She'd been weak and stupid and far too curious. And now, she couldn't get the stench out." Then we see her removing the fog from her mirror, staring at the reflection of herself. Then we cut to the black couple Jane and Roy, and we see they are arguing, or more specifically, Jane is yelling at Roy, who's reading a newspaper and doesn't seem to really be paying attention to her, and the narration says, "Afterwards, Jane and Roy had argued for days. They couldn't remember what they'd seen, just the way it had felt. That's what happens when fear comes out of the darkness. It hurts much worse in the light." Then we get some panels of the couple Karen and Jesse that were doing heroin that night, and the narration says, "Afterwards, Karen and Jesse hadn't said a word. Nothing out of the ordinary, really. They always had this unspoken agreement about the skag. Not to compare, just in case one had had a better time than the other." Then we zoom out from Jesse's silhouetted face, and we see she is standing in front of an open grave at a funeral because her partner Karen had apparently died from a heroin overdose that night. And as she stands there listening to the priest, the narration says, "Besides, at this point, what could Jesse possibly say?" Then we cut to the old woman, Miss Walker, who is sitting drinking tea, and the last time we saw her, I believe the ghost of her husband had appeared in her house, and it kind of looked like he was going to hurt her because he had some kind of farming tool in his hands. But as we see her right now, she's alive, obviously, and it looks like she didn't get harmed at all. And the narration says, "Afterwards, Miss Walker had finally admitted something to herself. She was half a person without her Charlie, and this was all her fault. The clock would seem to freeze momentarily as she watched it tick, tick, tick through another night of rubbish on the telly, and she began to cry seeing herself reflected in every parody of every miserable, nosy old lady on TV." Then we cut from her to Ken Riley, who is the guy who runs through the cemetery. And as he's running, we do see that ghosts begin to appear in the tombstones, and they're watching him. And the narration says, "Afterwards, Ken Riley had carried on as if nothing had happened at all. Nothing had. Still putting on weight. Still ignored and unloved. No one to blame but himself." Then we turn the page, and we cut to John sitting in the back of Chaz's taxi as they turn into the drive that goes through the cemetery near Slob's house. And as John looks out the window, his narration says, "So it's back to sunny Selhurst then. To skins, villains, and right little oiks who wish for no more than a quiet life and to whack the dog occasionally when things go wrong. It's where council kids play football at the grassy end of the cemetery, and many a 14-year-old has lost her cherry against the gravestone of an Edwardian gentleman." And then John says from the back seat, "Down there, Chaz, Tomate." And Chaz replies, "No problem." And then he turns to John and says, "Here, I heard about that poor sod who took your bet down at Ladbrokes. You're a bastard, Constantine." And then John smiles menacingly and says, "But a sexy one, Chaz." And as Chaz is driving, he's not really paying attention to the road because he's going very slow in the cemetery drive. And as he was talking to John, he had his head turned to the back seat. But luckily, John was looking forward and he yells out, "Blimey, mind out!" Because another car is coming down the very tiny drive, but it's coming towards Chaz. And as we get a panel that shows the driver exiting his vehicle, we see there are definitely one-way street signs that are pointing against the way Chaz came in. And we also saw these signs quite a bit in the first issue as Ken Riley the jogger was running in the direction of them. So as Chaz slams on his brakes, he yells out, "Aw shit, bugger and corruption." And then he gets out of his car and he walks towards the driver, who's actually on his knees looking at, I guess, the damage. I didn't realize they had collided, but I guess Chaz actually did hit the front of this man's car. So as the man is on his knee assessing the damage of his front light, he says to Chaz, "Bloody cabbies, think you own the sodden streets." And Chaz, who's kind of angry, replies, "We do when we've got the right of way, sunshine." Then the man stands up and says, "But you haven't. You was going the wrong way." And Chaz argues back, "I've done about 10 burials here, Tosh. This is the way in." And we see John is lighting a cigarette as this is going on. And then the man points at the signs and says, "Not anymore, mate. They changed it, didn't they?" Then we get a shot of the two cars and we see the way that Chaz entered now says no entry. And then the signs are pointing in the opposite direction Chaz entered it from. And upon hearing this, John looks around and he sees Ken jogging. And like I said, Ken is jogging in the direction of the newly established signs. So John looks at this and he says under his breath, "Changed it." And then he has a realization and he begins to laugh. And then Chaz, who's confused, goes over to John and says, "Don't tell me." And John fires back, "Don't ask then." And as he walks away from Chaz, he says, "Look, sort out your insurance and I'll be back in a bit." So John walks towards the direction of Ken as a very angry Chaz says behind him, "Yeah, fine." Then John stands on the grass next to the path and he watches Ken run by him and he says under his breath, "Wrong way, son." Then we get some narration that says, "I've heard my share of graveyard superstitions. On a dimwit scale of 1 to 10, most of them are 11s. Take the Irish, for instance. For centuries, they believed it prudent to take a different route home from the funeral. That way, the ghost of a loved one won't get confused and follow you home. It's a groundless fear, mind. You couldn't find a more physically stable environment than a cemetery if you tried. But it's the heightening of our emotions that stamps the memory of a dearly departed on the scene. It's the living that keep the dead alive. The Scots maintain the hallowed ground of a graveyard to be somehow separate from the rules that govern the outside world. In there, the dead lie in wait, wishing for a return to flesh, envious. Any grub tyke knows you don't go anti-clockwise around a graveyard. It offends the spirits lying within, makes them come back and haunt you at night. They call it walking Widdershins. And now, thanks in no smart part to Chaz and his poxy driving, the ludicrous truth comes out. Someone's upset the proverbial apple cart. Someone who's blissfully unaware of his mistake. So just as Ken is about to pass John fully, John kind of jumps in front of him and says, "You need to stop running." And of course, this freaks out Ken and he kind of stops in his tracks and he takes his headphones off and John says, "Look, there's a bit of a problem. It's about the wife, all right?" And Ken is confused, and as he pulls his headphones down, he says, "Do what? Who are you?" And John replies, "Go home, ask her why she never went to her dad's funeral. She has a good reason." And at that, Ken, who's still kind of confused, gets angry and he says, "What? How do you?" But John cuts him off and puts his hand on Ken's shoulder and he says, "I just know, Ken. Let me tell you something else." Then we turn the page and we see Ken sitting on a bench as John is walking away, so we don't get to hear what John says to him, but John's narration says, "The poor bastard. I give him the old once over, adding in a few subliminal hypnotic suggestions, just to make sure. 10 minutes it takes, during which time he urinates twice. But before you know it, I've brought him up to the finish line of his never-ending marathon. The rest is up to him. And me, well, someone somewhere owes me by my reckoning." Then we see John walk over to Chaz, who is waiting by the taxi, and he says to him, "Stand down, lads. Problem solved." And Chaz says, "About time," but John cuts him off saying, "Shh, listen." And then Chaz puts his hand up to his ear like he's trying to hear something, and he says, "What? I can't hear anything." And then John smiles and says, "I know. Quiet as a bloody graveyard, isn't it?" And then he walks over to one of the new directional signs, and he begins to pull it off, and he says, "Come on, mate. Give us a hand to put these back, eh?" Then we turn the page, and we get some panels of the people who were affected again, and we see Ken is in the first one, and he's talking to his wife, and the narration says, "Ken felt it first. this big quietness that settled over the cemetery houses. Calmly, he told his wife what he knew and why he loved her. He didn't feel like going out running tonight, he said. Maybe they could go somewhere together instead. Then we cut to Jane waking up next to her boyfriend Roy in bed, and the narration says, Jane felt it next, a return to normalcy, a thunderous silence at night. She could hear every noise outside her window once again, and all the ones that didn't exist as well. Then we cut to Irene, who is the woman who we last saw looking at herself in the bathroom mirror, thinking about what she had done, and we see her now vomiting in her toilet, and the narration says, It came to Irene in a flood of dirt and noise and tears, so she left it where she thought it belonged. Then we cut to old Miss Walker, who's standing in front of a gravestone, and the narration says, When Miss Walker felt it, she went outside to visit her Charlie, to put flowers on his grave, to keep his memory alive. Then we turn the page and we cut to John at a pub with Slob, and they're kind of sitting just by themselves together. And we can see in the background their friends are gathered, but they're kind of having their own conversation. And as John finishes the pint he's working on, Slob says to him, I do not belong. And as John gets a second pint, Slobodan continues saying, I do not belong, you see. It's why I leave my country. I was army cook, but still I witnessed the devil, Johnny Carrot. All around, this killing and fighting. I can be no part of this, I think. And then Slob begins to eat some chips as he continues saying, So, I come here, you see. We are needing new life, and finding it in here. And then he motions to John to all of the friends behind them. And John doesn't really say anything, he just kind of looks at the friends, and he thinks, All's well that ends abruptly then. The pattern of life and afterlife returns to its normal flow. It's all been just another reminder that I'm a favorite plaything of very perverse gods. Still, I can't help but wonder, why me? I mean, it's bloody cold out here on the fringes of the mystical demimonde. Then we see Rich call over to John saying, Oi, con job! Loser gets the next round. You in? And John says, Nah, Danny's in for me, all right. And then Slobodan leaves the bar and says, I will be in for the drink up. And John jokingly says to him, You'll be in for a stomach pump, old son. And then as John watches all of his friends race to drink a pint the fastest, his narration says, Another night falls victim to the hustle and bustle of ordinary madness. The games begin at the end of the bar, but I can't find the energy to join in tonight. It's been one of those weeks. I sense the gods conspiring again. See, it's a bit nerve-wracking being the universal crash test dummy. I can feel the gods' delight as they sort through their collection of interesting problems to present me. I can almost hear their joyful shouts as they get ready to shove the next one right up my arse. So why me exactly? I don't know, but I do know how the bloody chicken felt. And with that, he's referring to the chicken at the beginning of this issue that was killed, plucked, and stuffed with ice by Sir Francis Bacon. And in the last page, we see the end of this drinking game that all the friends were playing, and we see Slob pour his glass over his head, and all the friends are laughing, and some of them are kind of shocked and moving away because they don't want to get beer on themselves, but John is in the background covering his face like he's embarrassed by what Slob is doing. And that, my friends, is the end of the issue and the end of this storyline. So if you guys have any comments, questions, or suggestions, you can email me at planestrains and comicbooks, all one word, at gmail.com, and we will see you on the next one.